Egypt bred and killed millions of cats for a religious industry nobody talks about. Around 60 BCE, the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus watched a Roman visitor to Egypt accidentally kill a cat, and then watched an Egyptian mob kill the Roman for it, ignoring the pleas of royal officials and their own fear of Roman retaliation. The story has circulated for centuries as proof of just how sacred cats were to the ancient Egyptians, a civilization popularly remembered as having worshipped cats so completely that harming one, even by accident, could cost a person their life. That reputation is not wrong, exactly. Egyptian law and custom really did extend serious protection to cats living as household companions, and ancient writers really did record instances of mob violence in their defense. It is also not the whole story, and the rest of it did not come to light until 1888, when an Egyptian farmer plowing a field near the village of Beni Hassan broke through the ground into a mass grave containing what would eventually be estimated at somewhere between 180,000 and 300,000 mummified cats. The discovery did not lead to a museum exhibit within 2 years. Tons of those bodies had been shipped to England, ground up, and spread across British farmland as fertilizer. Egypt had not simply revered cats, it had bred and killed them by the millions on an industrial scale, as part of a religious economy modern popular memory has almost entirely forgotten. The same civilization capable of lynching a man over a single cat's accidental death ran breeding operations whose entire purpose was producing kittens to be killed on schedule. And reconciling those two facts requires understanding a distinction ancient Egyptians drew clearly, but modern popular history rarely bothers to explain. One that separated a beloved household animal from an anonymous animal, born, raised, and killed for a single transaction at a temple gate, the goddess behind it. The religious foundation for that industry rested on Bastet, a goddess whose own image shifted dramatically over the course of Egyptian history. In the earliest surviving depictions, Bastet appeared as a lioness, a fierce protective deity associated with war and the destructive power of the sun, closely related to other lion-headed goddesses like Sekhmet, with whom Bastet's mythology remained entangled even after her later transformation. Some traditions treated the two as sister aspects of the same underlying solar feline power, one channeling controlled protection, the other channeling outright destructive fury, a duality that never fully disappeared even once Bastet's image had softened considerably. Sometime before the first millennium BCE, her iconography softened into the domestic cat form modern audiences now associate with her exclusively, and her religious role shifted alongside that image, emphasizing protection of the home, fertility, motherhood, and guardianship against disease and evil spirits, particularly for women and children. Bastet's protective role extended specifically to households and, by extension, to the grain stores that fed them, a practical function tied directly to the domestic cat's real-world value as a hunter of the rodents and snakes that threatened stored food. That practical utility likely reinforced and possibly predated the theological reverence built up around the animal, giving Egyptian cat worship a foundation in genuine agricultural self-interest rather than pure abstract symbolism. A civilization dependent on carefully stored grain surpluses between Nile floods had concrete reasons to value an efficient rodent predator well before any goddess became formally associated with it. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests cats began this relationship with Egyptian and broader Near Eastern communities as self-domesticating opportunists drawn to grain stores by the rodents living in them, rather than as animals deliberately captured and tamed by early farmers, a slow, mutually beneficial process that predates any of Bastet's recorded temple worship by well over 1,000 years. By the time formal cat-headed depictions of Bastet appear in the archaeological record, the domestic cat had already been a fixture of Egyptian households and granaries for so long that its sacred status likely felt to ordinary Egyptians, less like a theological innovation and more like a formal religious acknowledgement of a relationship their ancestors had already taken for granted for generations. Bastet's primary cult center stood at Bubastis in the eastern Nile Delta, a city the Egyptians called Per Bastet, meaning House of Bastet, a name that survives in only slightly altered form in the site's modern name, Tel Basta. Herodotus, visiting Egypt in the 5th century BCE, described Bastet's temple there in enough architectural detail that his account has guided archaeological excavation of the site for the past century and a half, noting canals surrounding the sanctuary, extensive sculptural decoration, and a wide processional road lined with trees leading toward it. That temple, and the goddess it served, would eventually become the center of the largest annual religious gathering anywhere in Egypt. The festival, Herodotus claimed, the festival held annually at Bubastis in Bastet's honor, drew as many as 700,000 pilgrims, arriving by boat along the Nile in a scene he describes in unusual detail. Men and women packed together in every vessel, women shaking rattles, men playing flutes for the length of the voyage, and both sexes singing and clapping as they traveled toward the city. Herodotus went further, claiming Egyptians consumed more wine during this single festival than during the entire remainder of the year combined, a claim modern historians treat as likely exaggerated, but broadly indicative of just how central Bubastis had become to Egyptian religious and social life by his time. He also noted that women who traveled to the festival sometimes lifted their skirts and shouted at women in the towns they passed along the river, a detail of ritual license he recorded without much comment, suggesting the celebration carried an element of sanctioned transgression alongside its religious devotion, not unlike carnival traditions in other cultures built around a single, licensed break from ordinary social restraint. That festival atmosphere generated substantial local prosperity for Bubastis and its temple administration, well beyond the direct sale of votive mummies. Since hundreds of thousands of pilgrims arriving by boat needed food, lodging, and river transport for the duration of their stay, turning the city into a genuine seasonal economic center built almost entirely around a single religious event, comparable in economic function, if not in scale, to the way a modern city might organize its calendar and infrastructure around a single major annual festival or sporting event. A pilgrimage of that scale created a specific recurring commercial demand. Visitors arriving at Bubastis and at Bastet's other temples and shrines scattered across Egypt expected to purchase a votive offering, a physical object they could dedicate to the goddess as a prayer or a request for her favor. The same basic religious impulse that leads a modern visitor to light a candle in a cathedral. For a temple devoted to a cat goddess, the obvious, most powerful offering available was a mummified cat. Multiplied across hundreds of thousands of annual pilgrims, repeated over centuries, that demand required a supply chain no wild cat population could realistically sustain. The law that protected cats. The legal and social protections surrounding ordinary cats make the scale of that supply chain even more difficult to reconcile with popular assumptions. Diodorus Siculus's account of the lynched Roman, cited at the very start of this history, was not an isolated anecdote. Killing a cat in Egypt, even accidentally, carried social and sometimes fatal consequences severe enough that Ptolemaic officials reportedly could not save the Roman offender, despite direct intervention on his behalf, out of fear of provoking a wider diplomatic incident with Rome. Multiple ancient sources describe similar reverence. Cats rescued first during house fires, according to Herodotus, who reported that Egyptians would form a protective line around a burning building specifically to prevent cats from running back into the flames, prioritizing the animal's safety over firefighting efforts already underway. Formal mourning rituals followed a natural cat death. Households reportedly shaved their eyebrows as a visible sign of grief, A custom Herodotus contrasts directly with the more elaborate shaved head mourning observed after a dog's death. And pet cats that died naturally were embalmed and buried in consecrated animal cemeteries reserved for exactly this kind of individually mourned death. These protections were not simply a matter of private household sentiment. Diodorus Siculus, describing Egyptian religious custom more broadly, noted that individuals who killed sacred animals faced execution regardless of intent. A legal severity foreign visitors, like the unfortunate Roman in his anecdote, frequently failed to appreciate. Having no comparable taboo in their own cultures, Egyptian religious law appears to have treated the killing of a companion animal as a genuine offense against divine order itself, not merely a private wrong against the animal's owner, which is precisely what made the parallel existence of state-sanctioned, priest-run animal slaughter for the votive trade such a deliberately bounded exception rather than a simple hypocrisy nobody noticed. The exception was bounded specifically by location and purpose. Killing carried out inside a temple precinct by temple personnel for an explicitly religious transaction sat in a completely different legal and moral category from killing carried out anywhere else by anyone else for any other reason. A distinction Egyptian religious law apparently maintained without difficulty, even though it produced two wildly different fates for animals of the exact same species. None of that protection extended to the cats bred specifically for temple sacrifice. Egyptian religious thought appears to have drawn a functional distinction between a household's own companion cat, protected by genuine social taboo, and a separate category of animal raised from birth for a single ritual purpose, whose death was not a tragedy to be mourned, but the entire point of its existence. That distinction, invisible in most popular retellings of Egyptian cat reverence, is the hinge on which the whole contradiction turns. The industry behind the offerings. Modern Egyptology now estimates that ancient Egyptians produced roughly 70 million animal mummies in total across a period of around 1,500 years, spanning cats sacred to Bastet, ibises and baboons sacred to Thoth, falcons sacred to Horus, and numerous other species tied to specific deities. Cats represented a substantial share of that output, concentrated overwhelmingly in the late period and Ptolemaic era, roughly 664 to 30 BCE, precisely the centuries when temple pilgrimage and votive commerce reached their peak. The catacombs at Saqqara alone are estimated to have once held roughly 4 million ibis mummies dedicated to Thoth, a scale that puts the cat industry at Bubastis in useful perspective. Bastet's cult was not uniquely industrial. It was one particularly visible example of a pattern that ran across nearly every major Egyptian temple with an associated sacred animal, each one operating its own version of the same breeding to votive offering pipeline. Producing millions of cat mummies on that kind of timeline required more than opportunistic collection of animals that happened to die naturally near a temple. Archaeological and textual evidence points instead to dedicated catteries, breeding operations maintained by or closely affiliated with temple priesthoods, raising cats specifically to be killed young and mummified for sale. Egyptologist Salima Ikram, whose research on animal mummification has shaped much of the modern understanding of this practice, has described a functioning religious economy. Priests bred the animals, killed them at temple facilities, mummified them using techniques scaled for volume rather than the individualized care given to human burials, and sold the finished product directly to pilgrims arriving at the temple gates. The entire operation generated meaningful revenue for the temples that ran it, turning religious devotion into a durable, self-sustaining commercial enterprise built on a continuous supply of animals bred for no purpose beyond their own sacrifice. Temple estates in the late period controlled substantial agricultural land and labor independent of royal administration, giving priesthoods the practical infrastructure, feeding grounds, dedicated staff, storage facilities needed to run a breeding operation at genuine scale, rather than relying on whatever stray or surplus animals happened to be available in a given season. Papyrus records from temple administrations elsewhere in Egypt documenting staffing, food allocation, and revenue for comparable sacred animal operations give modern historians at least an indirect sense of how formally these breeding programs were organized, run by paid staff answering to temple management rather than left to informal or ad hoc arrangements. What the bones actually show. Radiographic and CT examination of surviving cat mummies has confirmed exactly how that sacrifice was carried out, and the findings are considerably more violent than the word offering tends to suggest. A majority of votive cat mummies examined radiographically show clear signs of unnatural death, most commonly spinal dislocation or cranial fracture, injuries consistent with deliberate killing rather than natural death followed by ritual preparation. A 2020 study using X-ray micro-CT scanning to digitally unwrap a mummified kitten found the animal was younger than 5 months old at death, based on dental and skeletal development, and had been strangled, its head separated from its body sometime after death during the mummification process itself. That kitten was not an outlier. The pattern of young age at death, combined with trauma consistent with strangulation or a deliberate blow to break the neck or skull, recurs across the broader body of scanned cat mummies closely enough that researchers treat it as standard practice rather than an occasional cruelty. A separate study examining cat mummies held in South African and European museum collections using CT scanning found a comparable pattern of young skeletal age across multiple, independently sourced specimens, reducing the likelihood that any single collection simply reflected an unusual local practice rather than a broader, standardized approach to raising and killing animals for the votive trade across Egypt's various temple centers. Researchers examining these patterns have generally avoided characterizing the killing methods as gratuitously cruel by the standards of the time, noting that spinal dislocation and cranial trauma, while violent, would have caused death quickly compared to alternative methods, which may reflect a genuine, if grim, effort at efficiency rather than deliberate prolongation of suffering. Whether that efficiency was motivated by any concern for the animal's welfare or purely by the practical need to process large numbers of kittens quickly during peak pilgrimage periods is not something the surviving physical evidence can answer on its own. And Egyptologists studying the practice have generally been careful not to project a modern ethical framework onto a ritual system that never articulated one in its own surviving texts. The animals were, in the most literal sense, raised on a schedule and killed on a schedule, timed to meet pilgrim demand, rather than allowed to live out any natural span at all. The mummification process applied to these votive animals also differed markedly from the careful, individualized treatment human mummification received. Embalmers working at industrial volume relied on standardized wrapping patterns, some genuinely elaborate and decorative on the outside, and used comparatively simple internal preservation methods. Natron packing and linen wrapping applied quickly rather than the extended, ritual-heavy process reserved for royalty and wealthy individuals. Some cat mummies were elaborately wrapped in geometric linen patterns, occasionally dyed and finished with painted or inlaid facial features, a level of external craftsmanship that stood in genuine contrast to the comparatively rushed, standardized treatment of the body inside, underscoring that these objects were built to be seen and purchased first, and preserved second. The fakes. A further layer of the industry only became visible once modern imaging technology let researchers look inside sealed wrappings without damaging them. A large-scale CT and X-ray survey conducted by the University of Manchester examined a broad sample of animal mummies, cats included, and found that roughly only 1/3 contained a single, complete, correctly matched animal. Another third contained partial remains, fragments of bone or tissue rather than an intact body. And the final third contained no animal material at all, just linen, mud, sticks, or other packing materials shaped and wrapped to resemble a genuine mummified offering. Rather than representing outright fraud in the modern sense, Egyptologists studying the phenomenon generally interpret these substitute mummies as a workaround inside a belief system where the wrapped, ritually presented form itself carried much of the religious weight, allowing a partial or symbolic offering to serve the same devotional function as a complete one when actual animal supply could not keep pace with pilgrim demand at a given temple on a given day. Some Egyptologists have proposed a further possibility, that a portion of these substitute mummies were never intended to deceive anyone at all, functioning instead as a recognized lower-cost tier of votive offering, openly sold as a symbolic rather than literal animal dedication, in much the way a modern donor might purchase a smaller or larger candle at a shrine with full awareness of exactly what they were buying and why. Researchers on the Manchester project noted that some of the substitute materials used inside these mummies, including eggshell fragments and small bundles of feathers, appear to have been deliberately selected because they carried some symbolic or material association with the intended animal, suggesting temple embalmers treated the substitution as a considered religious workaround rather than a purely cynical act of consumer deception. Whichever explanation applies to a given mummy, the practical result is the same. Something like 2 out of every 3 cat mummies pulled from Egyptian soil either never held a real cat or held only a fragment of one, meaning the actual scale of the killing operation behind Bastet's cult, staggering as the surviving numbers already are, still understates how many living animals the industry consumed to produce the genuine, fully intact offerings that made up the remaining third. The fertilizer ships that understated real total is exactly what makes the 1888 Beni Hassan discovery, and what happened to it, land considerably harder than it would as an isolated curiosity. The farmer who broke into the mass cat cemetery had stumbled onto centuries of accumulated votive burials, a cemetery scaled to match the industrial religious economy that produced it. Estimates of the total recovered range as high as 300,000 mummified cats, alongside smaller numbers of mongooses, dogs, and foxes, representing a find of genuine archaeological significance that, in a different era, might have anchored years of careful excavation and study. Egyptology as a formal discipline was still relatively young in 1888, and the systematic scientific study of animal mummies specifically would not mature for nearly another century, which meant the farmer's discovery arrived at almost exactly the wrong moment. Too late to be dismissed as agricultural debris, but too early to be recognized as the kind of large-scale religious and economic evidence later researchers would eventually treat it as. Instead, in February 1890, roughly 180,000 of the mummies, weighing close to 20 tons, were loaded onto steamships bound for Liverpool. An Alexandrian merchant had purchased the lot, and English buyers acquired it at auction specifically as agricultural fertilizer. Ground bone and preserved tissue considered valuable for its nitrogen and phosphate content rather than its religious or historical significance. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe the auctioneer conducting the sale using a cat skull from the shipment as his gavel, a detail that reads today as almost too on the nose to be real, and is nonetheless well documented. Most of the shipment was spread across English farmland within the following growing season. A small number of mummies were salvaged by museums and private collectors before the bulk of the cargo was processed, which is the only reason any physical evidence of the discovery survives today at all. The British Museum ultimately retained only a single cat skull from the entire find, a fragment representing what may have been hundreds of thousands of individually bred, killed, and mummified animals, and local children at Beni Hassan reportedly sold additional mummies directly to early tourists as curiosities before the larger commercial shipment was even organized. A final, smaller-scale echo of the same votive commerce that had produced the cemetery in the first place, now aimed at foreign visitors instead of ancient pilgrims. Legacy genetic analysis of surviving cat mummies, published in the following decades, has confirmed what the historical record already implied. The animals bred for Bastet's temples were domestic cats. Felis catus, closely related to the wild Near Eastern populations from which the domestic lineage originally split, rather than a separate sacred subspecies invented by later tradition. That genetic continuity connects the cats ground into Victorian fertilizer directly to the ancestors of every house cat alive today. A chain running from religious economy to farmland to modern living rooms in a single unbroken biological line most cat owners have never heard about. A 2007 genetic study tracing the origins of domestic cat lineages worldwide found that nearly all modern house cats descend predominantly from a Near Eastern wildcat population, Felis sylvestris libica, the same regional lineage well represented among the Egyptian temple mummies, meaning the cat asleep on a modern couch is, genetically speaking, a much closer relative of Bastet's sacrificial kittens than most owners would ever suspect. That closeness runs in both directions. The same instincts, appetite, and physical structure that made a cat a valuable grain store predator in Bronze Age Egypt and later a marketable votive commodity in late-period temple economies are the same traits a modern owner recognizes and values in an entirely different, purely domestic context, 3,000 years and one religious industry removed from where that relationship actually began. The version of ancient Egypt that survives in popular imagination, reverent, cat-worshipping, gentle toward animals, is not fabricated so much as incomplete, built on the genuine legal protections and mourning rituals extended to household pets, while leaving out the industrial religious economy that operated in parallel, breeding, killing, and mummifying millions of animals whose entire purpose was to be sold and buried. Both realities are historically accurate at once. The same civilization that would kill a man for accidentally stepping on a cat ran catteries specifically to produce kittens for strangulation. And both practices flowed from the same underlying belief that a cat's life mattered because of what it represented to the gods, whether that meaning demanded the animal's protection or its death. Modern Egyptology has spent barely more than a century piecing that fuller picture back together, largely because the physical evidence needed to do so, millions of individually wrapped, individually killed animals, was scattered, sold, and in the case of Beni Hassan, plowed directly back into foreign soil before anyone thought to ask what the bones inside those wrappings might actually reveal. English fields that received a portion of the Beni Hassan shipment in 1890 have, in the intervening century, been repeatedly plowed, harvested, and replanted many times over, meaning whatever calcium and organic material those cats once contributed to the soil has long since cycled through generations of ordinary British crops. An almost absurdly literal way for a religious economy built on sacred animals to end its run.